Hello and welcome to Warblog. Today we're going to look at the Saur Revolution. Yeah, it's not a fantastic playthrough. I'm not sure how far I'm going to get. I sort of wish I'd done it on a slightly smaller map because I don't need this top bit, and I could probably gotten rid of this bottom bit. Sort of possibly making it, well, more that size actually, not that size, more this size, the Jalalabad Coup. Still a large map, but not as tall. But that doesn't matter. It's interesting. It is sort of covered by Wikipedia, but I actually got it, from as the first thing in the war in Afghanistan by Mir Akber, which is. I kind of like the way that's written because it's it has sort of time units, so it's sort of like 10 o'clock, the 16th of July. There are some protests in such and such a place, or 20th of July through to whatever, and he sort of sequences it like that, and it's quite nice to sort of to actually see it structured that way, as opposed to having to sort of interpret the narrative quite closely. But possibly more intriguing is I can't remember exactly what's what, but I think he was a reporter and he was sort of quite close to it. It seems quite an interesting book in its format, but the point I'm trying to get to here is it's quite an old book. And Wikipedia just doesn't really seem to have the same. Well, to start off with, his book doesn't refer to it as the Saur Revolution. It just says there was a coup in Afghanistan, and here it says, also called the April Revolution or the April Coup. And it's worded slightly different. I don't want to be sort of controversial, but it touches on the controversial because it's different. He words it different. He makes it sound different. When you read it, it's more like this party. Well, I'm pointing here, but the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, was basically born out of a sort of a magazine that was printed for 6 weeks, and it was noted for being particularly popular amongst the student element before it was banned by the Republic, I think. Who is it? The Republic of Afghanistan, their government ministers. And so there weren't rights over that. He sort of got part and parcel of the background here about the I don't want to go into too much detail, but a bit of background about how someone was shot. So where is that? Yeah. So on the 17th of April, a prominent member of the Parsham. Now the Parsham is actually a sort of group of people. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Usually it pops up, irritatingly. Okay. Parsham was the name of one of the factions of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. The Parsham was seized power. Okay, so anyway, so a prominent member of this group was assassinated, or was murdered, and the government issued a statement saying they deplored the assassination. But essentially, in Mir Akber's book, it seems to make it a little closer to the fact that the assassination was probably. Well, I'm going to pause it here because I want to talk about the Mir Akber books. It's interesting, isn't it? Okay. Well, I don't know. I think he was a reporter for the Independent newspaper in England, and it's going back to the times when it would have been an independent paper. And I think it was written in 1988. So that's 10 years. No, go away. I really detest all this auto-updating from everything. So anyway, this Okay, so Mir Akber Khyber, a leading figure in the Pashtun faction of the PDPA, was shot dead. There was outrage amongst the intelligentsia in Kabul. They believed he'd been murdered by agents of President Mohammed Daoud, etc., etc. So essentially, there are lots at the funeral. The funeral turns into a demonstration, and that's not what Wikipedia sort of really details. Wikipedia really puts the focus on them being communists. Even says that their flag was a blatant sort of copy of the communist flag. And Mark Urban's book really doesn't put the onus on them being communists. I mean, they might have been, but I don't really know much more about it. But there's a distinct difference between where he wrote it up in 1988 and the way it's written up here, and in particular, women's rights, human rights. There's none of that in Mark Urban's book. And I really doubt that it was much to do with women's rights. It was a revolution, a coup, in the sort of general sense, following a coup that was essentially ignited by a demonstration, a crowd of 15,000 people who packed the streets of Kabul to show their grief for the death of this man. The funeral march became a display of strength by the Afghan left. The targets of their chanting, the USA, the CIA, and the Shah of Iran's secret police, the SAVAK. The march was the biggest in Kabul in several years, and President Daoud, facing a severe economic crisis and in view of the developments, with increasing alarm, and essentially he arranged for his secret police to arrest all the leading members of the PDPA. So, that's not really how Wikipedia writes it up. During the funeral ceremonies for Khyber, protest against the government occurred, and shortly thereafter, most of the leaders of the PDPA, including Babrak Karnal, were arrested by the government. However, Hafizullah Amin, was put under house arrest. This gave him a chance to order an uprising, one that had been slowly coalescing for more than 2 years. Amin, without having authority, instructed the Khalist army officers to overthrow the government. So I suppose that's sort of pretty much on par with Mark Urban's book. But I think up here it pretty much just says it was a communist overthrow, and that's not how I sort of initially read it. It was really more of a something that grew out of the assassination of such and such, whoever it was, and the suppression of the PDPA by putting them in prison. But what Mark Urban's book says is essentially what the Republic failed to do, that they arrested a lot of the PDPA, but they didn't arrest their key leaders, and I've written this one down. The President Mohammed Daoud Khan begins to use the secret police to round up the ringleaders of the PDPA. However, he fails to arrest their most important accomplices in the army, and they activate the 4th and 15th Brigades, now who are in Pol-e-Charkhi, which is there. Now, so the thing is, the Wikipedia says that this guy ordered the revolution, whereas the Mark Urban book sort of says that the most important members of the PDPA were actually still active and actually in the army, and they hadn't arrested those people. So I don't want to get too controversial with it, but it's interesting reading, and it's one of the reasons I like books, because it's quite a lot harder to actually edit them and to change history, which I think Wikipedia is blatantly guilty of. In a sort of a traditional Orwellian 1984 format. I mean, just as an aside, I've got a lot of old newspapers, hundreds of years old in sort of bound volumes, and essentially I haven't really identified anything yet, but you can get a lot of these newspapers online, and people would think, oh well, it's got to be the truth, but I'm pretty certain that there's editing of these newspapers going on, because it's all digital format. You can actually see the digital text forming, and unless someone's got an original copy of the newspapers that they make, they can actually alter history. And unless you own the copies, and I do actually own quite a large number of old newspapers, and it does make me wonder whether or not there's any inherent value in that. And furthermore, I mean, I do like to buy these books, and the older ones are better, because you get a different slant on what was written. For example, the book on the Uganda-Tanzania War is very biased towards the Tanzanians, because the author who got all his material by working with the Tanzanian army. So I've mentioned this before, but he's everything Ugandans did was stupid, and everything the Tanzanians did was sort of noble. The Ugandans couldn't shoot for toffee, and the Tanzanians were a highly trained professional army. So you can pick up a bias, and there's always going to be a sort of bias. And I try to be as neutral as I possibly can, and I think it's one of the things about this sort of mathematical approach. There's no bias on what was what. But getting back to this in particular, and the thing that I wanted to sort of just conclude with, the sort of general blurb. I didn't really intend to sort of make a general blurb, but with the sort of opening statement, is that this is flagged up here as sort of like part of the Soviet-Afghan War, and I did sort of flag it up as that. But basically, the Soviet-Afghan War didn't start until later on in the year. I mean, it might even say Soviet-Afghan War is a prelude. So the Soviets didn't enter, or presumably, until the 24th of December 1979. So that's an entire year later. So this is not technically part of the Soviet-Afghan War, but I don't want to sort of put another war thing in here to include that. It's basically probably did have a little bit of influence behind the I don't want to sort of put in because we've got war in Afghanistan 2001 to present. We've got Soviet-Afghan War. We've got the Afghan Civil War, and I don't want to have another one that covers just those two periods. I mean, I could do, but I think it's fair enough to put it under that because it's the prelude. And essentially, the thing is, so that's that. It's not actually part of the Soviet-Afghan War, but I flagged it up as that, as a sort of prelude. So it's a year and a half before they do that, and in that year and a half, they take power, and they prove themselves to be quite unpopular. And I think it's interesting really to sort of to conceive how that sort of dynamic worked in a lot of regards, because essentially. And I think the Wikipedia sort of tries to suggest it was more than what it should be. But in Mark Urban's book, he actually describes it quite nicely. And I haven't really even got past the first 2 or 3 pages. I think it's this, just after this list of things that happens. Okay, so the PDPA were confirmed in power. Around the world, governments tried to find out exactly who the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan were. Taraki's party was founded in January 1965. During the spring of '66, his followers published a newspaper called Kalik, Masses. Kalik stands for is masses interpreted. Although the paper lasted only 6 weeks before it was banned, it had a lasting influence among its mainly student readership. Now, just to sort of add to the bigger picture on this, if we look here, what I'm doing next. Now, this next scenario is tied in, but it's not actually that important. It's the Jalalabad coup, and I've called it Jalalabad coup. It's not got a name, but it follows on. When they took over Kabul, essentially, which is what we're dealing with here, this garrison held out, but also the garrison in Jalalabad held out. And Jalalabad is, I mean, Kabul, to get there you have to go along this road. Probably about three maps of these are long, 2 or 3 of them are long, and I haven't finished yet, but there's Jalalabad there. And the sort of picture I'm building up, and one thing of interest is that this is the the bypass, the Kabul bypass. I'm not sure it existed in 78, but I don't have a feature on Google Maps to take me back to 78, so I put it in there. It doesn't matter. But the point is, it was as much fortuitous, I interpret, as anything else, because if the Republic government hadn't assassinated the main leader, and they denied it, and the Wikipedia seems to put an emphasis on that denial, sorry about the silence. I'm just trying to find the bit where it sort of denies. I can't read that quickly. I wonder what that one is. That looks interesting. I'll have to do that. Oh, I can't find it. Oh, right. On the 17th of April 1978, a prominent member of the Pasha we've already read was murdered. Although the government issued a statement deploring the assassination, Nur Mohammed Taraki of the PDPA charged that the government was responsible, believing that was a belief that was shared by much of the Kabul intelligentsia. The PDPA leaders apparently feared that Daoud was planning to eliminate them. So what we got here is the government is prepared to murder its opponents and deny it. And we don't know who did it, but you know, I'm not saying I did because I don't know. But it's just the wording, and I think you can't work. I've seen Wikipedia articles where you read a paragraph and then the next paragraph is exactly the same thing, but it's obviously written by someone else, and so it's not. You can't always rely on them to have complete and utter sense. But it says here, although the government issued a statement deploring the assassination, Taraki of the PDPA charged that the government itself was responsible, a belief that was shared by much of the Kabul intelligentsia. So there's not a lot of bias in that statement. When I first sort of read it, I sort of thought, although the government was blamed, I don't know, I took it the other way around. But the point is, if they hadn't been assassinated and the other members of the PDPA didn't happen to just start being arrested, there wouldn't necessarily been this huge sort of protest after the funeral. And I think more to the point, the point I'm trying to get to, and it's not really related directly to the sort of the stem that I'm going along at the moment, the train of thought I'm following at the moment, is that these people probably wouldn't have risen up. They were just prominent members within the 4th and the 15th Brigade, which are over here. Now, what I'm trying to actually sort of get to on that in the bigger picture is essentially this: is Afghan's quite a sort of sparse country, and it's the sort of place, especially in 78, where sort of being able to sort of have members of your organisation inside the army is probably not that difficult. The vetting process for things like the British Army are probably mind-bogglingly in depth, especially in the modern age. But in those days and age, it was slightly different. And the point I'm trying to get to here is that essentially they didn't represent the whole country. They just happened to do it. They happened to be pressured. They happened to be in a position where they could actually then take control of 2 armoured brigades, and an air regiment, which we'll get onto in a bit, and they just happened to be in a position close to the capital to be able to take it. And there were 1,800 Republican Guards in the palace. I've got some of them there. Now I've given them 113 strength, but 1,800 really they should have much higher strength. So I don't want to sort of make it difficult. And and this is why I've sort of brought the Jalalabad coup into place, because they didn't follow. So the 11th, I think it was the 11th, I can't remember who it was here. Let's see what Mark Gerben's book says. It says here, yeah, the 11th Division. So the final death toll was put as 1,000. Armoured units were dispatched to Jalalabad, where loyalist officers of the 11th Division refused to accept the coup. So essentially, it wasn't sort of like this popular uprising. And as soon as they got into power, they were saying things. I won't read everything that Mark Urban said, because I don't want to sort of just take too long over that. But a lot of people didn't know who they were. And that they just sort of had some sort of ideology. I don't know. I'm presuming it was left leaning, more towards the communist sort of side of things, than anything else. They said, we're thinking about the people, but the religion is also not going to be in any way undermined, etc. Sort of the Muslim religion, presumably. In fact. But, and they did a lot of things, that land reform, that no one really liked. But what I'm trying to get to here again and again, and without making a lot of huge driving success on it, is that it was really sort of quite fortuitous, and in sense that, there's not much of an infrastructure, and there's not much of a nation, and they just happened to be able to sort of have people in this brigade, in these two brigades, that were sympathetic, that could actually sort of carry out a coup of that nature. And so that was the whole background to it. And really, just over a couple of days, these things ignite a change of events that have essentially everlasting repercussions. I mean, that's the sort of, I think, maybe the point I'm trying to get to here is that there could have been other organizations, etc. So essentially what happens here, what we got are these protesters. Now nothing really happens. They protest and the police deal with them. So there's nothing really that you need to do. You're not going to take the capital. They're not going to just take all these. But during this sort of process, they're arresting these leading members of the PDPA. And so what happens then on turn 10, you then get, and I'm just putting these things in as tokens really, just so that you can sort of see how it works. You then get the 4th Armoured Brigade, and I've only put in essentially a company or elements of a representation, because I'm pretty sure that you should be able to defeat whatever you need to. And you get the elements of the 15th Armoured Brigade, so it's 2 886 units, but they also get the I've not updated them both the same, but this 322 Air Regiment, they're MiG-21s, they should say the same thing. Now they fly over the Central Corp HQ here to deter them. They also bomb the palace, which is under here. Now this unit essentially, so the airport is over there, so one of these units comes out here, takes the airport, and presumably you can follow on to take the palace. The other unit basically comes straight over here to do that, and then you get air support, and so that's how the coup works. And I mean, it's as simple as that. And I'm sort of a bit reluctant really to sort of, because I've been talking for 23 minutes now, to actually go through 10 whole turns, but I think I might give it a go. So essentially we've got all these protesters. Okay, so they're fighting the police. What I might do is just blast through 10 turns. Now, the thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the dates, the 15th of April, Mir Akber Khyber is shot. Essentially, his funeral is on the 19th, which turns into a demonstration. So this is the 19th, and it wasn't until the 26th of April they start arresting the secret police start arresting the PDPA. So we've got from the 19th until the 27th when the 4th and the 5th Armoured Brigades make their move. So that's 8 days. It's just over a week, and it doesn't really necessarily state that they protested for a week, but I'm going to assume that they did, because not much else to do. 1-to-1 and a DR. Well, that was interesting. So they've pushed all the police out of the royal palace. Do they actually have movement 1? Okay. Yep. So we've stacked up there. So we've now captured the presidential palace, which wasn't what happened, but they will be able to get out, especially when we've got army units involved. This should be a 7-to-1. In fact, we don't even need to use the police. Let's just use this one army unit. Yeah, so they just basically trunched back into now. What I'm actually going to do, I'm just going to go through this 10 times. Okay, so what we've now got are extra units there, but we've also got our 4th and 15th. And yes, it's the 4th that head into the city, and the 15th to take the airport. So let's move the 4th in this direction. Oh no, that's the infantry. Okay, and we're going to bomb the palace. Okay, so it's the Republic of Afghanistan's turn. Now, I think the first thing we've got to possibly do is, because we've got 4 units in there, we want to put them in the palace. So we've got to swap them round, but we're going to have a stacking limit because we won't be able to move that into there. So what we're going to do, I think, is to use one of these units, because we're going to leave one in there anyway, to move these protesters out. That'll be a 7-to-1 because they're protesters, and that's eliminated him. We'll move the police out, apart from one. Right. Now these units here could have been involved. There's 4 of them, but the air units sort of straff them. We haven't actually done that, but you know, we can assume that it did. Now these are the only ones, the Karga garrison, that sort of unaccounted for. It's not stated whether or not they chose a side or behaved in any particular way. So that's the sort of first move. Right, so we're going to take the airport. Yep. So that's easy. And let's just make sure these police are well and truly on their way. Yep. And see what we can do here. What I'm suspecting is that 8 is not going to be enough. Maybe I should put in some more. Maybe I should just double it. But let's just carry out some airstrikes first. It does say they sent in some armoured first and then they were reinforced later. So 1.8, 1, 1.4, 1.6. Let's do an attrition first, just to sort of get a sense for the odds. Hopefully it'd be more than 1 to 1 or more, so it's 1 to 2. I thought it would be something that tight. So it looks like we're going to need a bit more than that. Well, that's that. They're not going to do anything else. There's no point in dealing with these protesters. The police really can't do anything. They could possibly try and attack this stack here, but they're not going to get any odds against an 8 armoured unit. So we'll move swiftly on there. I'm going to straff this just once, just to keep historically accurate. So we've done some damage there. That will teach them that they're not going to come out now. They've been deterred. That was the purpose of that. And we're going to bomb the palace. It's going to take a while, but we can possibly get these guys out of the way. A 2 to 1. Okay. Let's try an attrition. 1 to 1. Okay, I'm pretty much going to double what they've got. They can't really do anything to counter these attacks, so they're just going to sit there. The only reason I'm leaving that in the fort is because I'm pretty sure they would. It's a strong point. So the battle for the palace is ongoing. So we've got the MiGs coming in to bomb them, and just as a point of note, the Wikipedia calls them Su-7s, whereas Mark Urban calls them MiGs. Now, I'm not even sure that Su-7s existed in 1978, but it's an interesting what's the word? Mismatch, because one of them's wrong and one of them's right, and who is it? I don't know at this moment. I don't know, but and I can't see any purpose behind not getting that correct. So maybe it was Mark Urban just didn't know at that time. But he said MiG-21, so Okay, I'm going to try and attack. Yeah, it's going to be even worse. No, I'm not. I'm going to leave it one more turn. See what we can do with the air power. So these police units are taking some hits, but they don't seem to be really building up to anything. Let's put everyone in there and see whether that increases the odds, at least on the attrition. No, still a 1-to-1. But we've got 2 damage, which is good. So, now they're just going to sit there and recover, so they'll gain a fatigue back. They're all down 1, so if we can get some big numbers on this air attack. Obviously pressed the wrong button there. Huh. 2 more damage, and we pushed one of these police units out. Okay, well they're going to sit there and try and recover. But what I'm going to do, it's just to make things faster. I'm going to call it an all or nothing now. .5, 2.7, 3.7, 2.9. Okay, so I'm just going to attack. Well, hopefully it'll be more than a 1-to-1, but it might only be a 1-to-1. 2-to-1 and an exchange. Well, we've got a rout. Okay. Well, that exchange is going to be nullified, but with some luck, .2, .4. Okay, let's do another attack here. 3-to-1 DE. So this one failed its morale. The armour move in. And take the palace. And that's that. Now I think I'm definitely going to give them more armour. And that's it really. And you know, so it's again, it's not something that you can sort of play, you know, in any sort of competitive sense. But I think it's, you know, just sort of having a brief understanding, or you know, of how that worked. It helps and it changes things. And I can't really say exactly what I thought too much, because I'm really just sort of building through. I'm just trying to sort of, I'm just picking battles and sort of starting generally at the beginning. A lot of the battles that I've started in earnest start from the beginning, where not everything's particularly exciting. You know, the Jalabad one might be more exciting because the only reference I've got is from this Mark Urban book that says that it basically says that the armoured units were dispatched, so we can assume that they're from the 4th or 15th, to Jalalabad, where officers of the 11th Division. So that's it. So we're armoured units from the 4th or 15th Brigade go and fight units from the 11th Division. And so it might be a reasonable battle, possibly balanced. But in this one, you've got to go through 10 turns of protesters. We don't know whether or not the protesters were just there for day one, and then whether they went, and then the arrests were made, 8 days later. So it's just a picture, really. But I think the thing that sort of came to my mind in this is that, especially with something like Afghanistan, you get the same places again and again. Now, I'm not sure whether I've got any Kabuls, but if you do a search for Jalal, we've got two. So this is from 1989. It's the Afghan Civil War. So this is just almost immediately after the Soviets left, and obviously this one is just previous to when they arrive. Slightly different maps, and that interested me as well. I went out and I was thinking, so we've got part of this, and we can see this, and this is obviously a little closer in on that. But you can see that sort of river point there, those two bridge points, they sort of tie up. This one's going north and the other one was going sort of, more sort of northeast. But it's a bit like, what's that place called? Idlib. It's a bit like Idlib. Which, in the Syrian Civil War, we've got the first Battle of Idlib, 2012, Idlib, 2015, Southern Idlib, that doesn't really count, but then Idlib, 2018, which didn't go through. But, the same sort of places keep propping up, and I'm not sure how many Kabuls we've got, because sometimes they don't actually come up because it's not in the title. Yeah, so this one doesn't even come up once. But the point is that you've got two lots of Jalalabads, and you sort of start to wonder how many times have these particular cities been fought over. Now, how many battles of Kabul have there been, and what were the similarities? Because there are going to be different things. I mean, here it was more of a coup, so they didn't have to fight their way in through prepared defences. But if you look at it, especially from a map, this looks very artificial. This sort of almost a rectangle of hills, very defensive, a lot of bridges. Jalalabad, you've got it's all on the bank there, so you've got this one bridge, but you've got the approach goes near this bridge, so you can defend there and you can defend there. So there's only 2 points to cross. So you've got great sort of defensive position there. You can defend there easily, so you can really sort of keep a concentrated front. It's probably historical, for that position, for almost probably for that reason. But what I'm saying is, you can sort of you can look at these and you start to sort of get the same places being fought over. Even in other wars. Afghanistan. This is Afghanistan, but Syria, obviously, places like Libya, where there isn't really, a great deal. But also, Nigeria and these African places, etc., etc. And the same places are being fought over, time and time again, and exchanging hands. And it's just quite intriguing, really, how that can happen. You would imagine that they get used to it. I often wonder, for example, Palmyra I think that changed hands quite a few times, and a few other places. I mean, Aleppo, Mosul, there was decimated, but I imagine it gets to the stage where there's not a lot left to be destroyed, and it doesn't really matter, and they sort of factor in this sort of a constant ebb and flow of warfare into their sort of way of life and in the way they build things and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I don't know really. I wouldn't assume that there's too much of that, but even in Syria and in Iraq at the moment, and your men, they're going to be permanent sort of reminders of the defensive fortifications. These huge sort of like almost entrenchments that run across the desert in some places, huge mounds of earth that have been built around the some of the cities. I really can't see that they're going to put priority on sort of leveling all that. I mean, ideally you'd imagine that they would go around with bulldozers and just fill them all in, but in some cases I don't think that's possible. But it's interesting really when you sort of consider those sorts of things. I'm not sure how natural the fortification in Aleppo is, but there's a huge mound of a huge fortress on it, and that they use that. I mean, that's just another example of something. I mean, that goes back to antiquities as a defensive fortification. I don't think it was man-made, but I'm not sure of the geography of it or the geology of it. But the fact that they used it, and there's a lot of that in the sort of the Yugoslavian, the sort of the Eastern European conflicts, where fortifications and positions that was almost medieval were used again. I think it's a bit unfair, really, in a grand sense, because they can't stand up to sort of like the heavy artillery that, and especially sort of the bombing that can be applied to them in this sort of modern age. But then again, you sort of wonder, well, how much of all this conflict is going to sort of be result in the sort of permanent reminder that we're all used to with traditional fortifications and features. I mean, it could be something as simple as a bridge that's blown out that never gets repaired. I mean, the Libyan desert, North African desert, is littered even today with Second World War tanks, and you get a lot of tanks across Africa, and they just sit there, and pillboxes and concrete fortifications and all these sorts of things. And makes you wonder, really, to some extent, how all that plays out in the long term. This is Kabul. I'm pretty sure they've got sort of some fairly heavy sort of green zone style defensive features in place at the moment. I know they've got around Baghdad and things like that. Yeah, it was just a thought, really. I'm just wondering, how many of these places we've got here again and again. In Idlib, we just saw there's 3 direct. Right, there's two battles. I know there's another one that I haven't done. A lot of these places, we've even got the evidence of them being fought over multiple times. Assaults coming in here, assaults coming in there. The conquest of Mosul, the liberation of Mosul. What's that other? There's another sort of big one. Fallujah. I mean, that was taken fairly early on, exchanged hands quite a few times. So I just a general thought, really. Probably lost my train of thought on that, but I hope you find this sort of interesting. As I say, it's not a sort of competitive game. I mean, it could possibly have been a competitive game with just the two, as I've just had it there. But to be quite honest, I sort of want to make it a little easier for the red ones, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, to reflect the historic sort of dialogue on that, and I don't think it should really go either way. I think they had armoured units and air power against 1,800 troops in a palace. It really probably was just a matter of time. But it's an attractive map. I'm not sure how accurate I've got the city. As I said, this is 1978, so I'm not sure how much of this sort of actually existed, and I have sort of done less rather than more. If you look at it now, I think there's more around the edges, but the shape, I think the point I'm going to maybe is that I'm not so sure of the shape, because especially when I look at Mark Urban's book, it is more of a sort of, it's more like that, but it's quite hard to sort of distinguish that, because you've got these two areas here. Now this area here, hills, should be just southeast of this road, sort of more there, but there's two areas of hills, and I've not really had a close look to see what significance they have, but they seem to be sort of open land, either sort of parkland or non-buildable, similar to the sort of large mound of earth in Aleppo, really. But so, whether or not this should be urban or this should be urban, I don't know. Whether it is really sort of more like that or it is more like this. I did use a bit of artistic license with these things coming out here, so maybe it should be sort of more like this. But what I'm saying is I'm not so sure of the shape, but I think it's an attractive map. I always, once I get to this sort of stage of complexity, they always become quite intriguing just to look at. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed the listen to me warble. As I said, it's the start of the sort of the build up to the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and I intend to sort of do the whole lot eventually, but build up to it sort of methodically from the start. I've already got quite a few in place as it is, so this is more symbolic of the significance and the importance of the actual the affairs that were happening on their ground, as opposed to sort of their military significance in the strategic or tactical sense. But it's important to understand that this was where the coup began, that led towards the more left-wing government of Afghanistan rising to power, and then essentially being involved with the with the Soviets. And incidentally, I don't want to warble on too much, but they were pretty much, I think, they were big on land reform. I don't want to read what Mark Urban says on that, but basically states that everything went wrong with that. They were throwing people off the land that shouldn't have been. Everything they did wasn't improving productivity; it was going down. They had existing ways of financing farming operations that were no longer available, so there were farmers going out of business left, right and centre. But the point is, at some point, there's a lot of, I haven't really got through to it, but I've sort of skim read some of it, and one of the main guys, if not the main guy, and I don't want to find out who it was actually assassinated, and this sort of annoyed the Soviets, so I think were giving sort of some support to the PDPA, and their main guy was assassinated, and as such they invaded Afghanistan. And it's in the Wikipedia and possibly in the Mark Urban book, I can't remember what, so I'm just guessing here in that sort of grander sense, but there were sort of UN votes on it, because they said that they were supporting a failing regime that was being undermined and on the brink of civil war. And so although the Soviets invaded, they were actually working on the premise that they were invited by the majority of the people, and that they were there with the goodwill of the people. But it does also state that it was an invasion, essentially after the person that they had in their favour in charge of power was shot, and things looked to be going sort of in a different direction. So that's in 18 months' time. So I'm not sure what happened militarily in that. Probably nothing happens between now and December 79, but I don't know, because I haven't really got there. There could be a few other sort of protests or skirmishes or minor uprisings, etc. Yeah, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. You know, as I said, if you want to play this, you know, sign up and you can print and play with your friends and all of that sort of stuff. Even play it with and watch it without ads, etc. And I will speak to you later. Cheerio. Bye.